So I want to start out with a kind of a little quiz, pretty simple. I'm going to share some names with you, and I want you to see if you can figure out what they all have in common. Walt Disney, Steve Jobs, Garrison Keillor, J.K. Rowling, Steven Spielberg, Bruce Springsteen, and J.R.R. Tolkien. Storytellers. Each and every one of them are tremendously gifted and talented storytellers. And they tell their stories for various reasons. Some of them tell stories in order to entertain us. Some tell their stories in order to inform us or to educate us. Some tell their stories in order to move us or motivate us or inspire us. And sometimes it's a combination of those things. But great storytelling is the common thread that runs through all of their work. I find storytelling to be absolutely fascinating. One of the things that's fascinating about storytelling is that people in every culture, people in every nation, people, whatever language they speak, people in every time and every place, this is universal. They universally love to tell stories, and they also love to hear stories. What is it that accounts for that fact, that accounts for the universal presence and universal popularity of stories? Well, I can think of at least three things, and you might be able to think of more, but for one thing, one reason is that stories just hold our attention. Somebody can start rattling off of a bunch of facts and it's boring, but once they start telling a story, suddenly we are engaged. I remember when my daughter was little, one of the things both my wife and I loved to do was, tuck her in at night, and we would read to her, and we would read a chapter of a book, and at the end of the chapter, without fail, it happened every single time. When we were done with that chapter, she would say, "Read me another." And that's probably happened to you as well. And what's fascinating about this is that we never really, even as adults, we never outgrow our love for stories, especially really good stories. As every grown-up who has ever binge-watched something on Netflix can tell you. It's like, oh, let's just watch one more episode of Breaking Bad or House of Cards or Mad Men or whatever it is. I think it could be argued that one of the reasons that television caught on as quickly as it did, and before television, radio caught on as quickly as it did, is because they're basically storytelling media. And if you think about it, even the best commercials, the ones that we remember, are 30 to 60-second stories. Every Budweiser ad during the Super Bowl, it's about that dog and that horse, and you want to know what happens to them. Facts just inform us, but stories engage us. They grab our interest and they hold our interest. And how is that? What makes that happen? Well, it's a second characteristic of stories, and that is that they stir our emotions. They stir our imaginations too, but they really grab our emotions. I've been talking for the past 6 months, and I'll quit soon, but I've been talking about how we had to do all of this work at our house because last December we discovered this mold, and we had to have mold remediation and tear out drywall and all this kind of stuff. And one of the last things that we did when everything was done, everything was painted and stuff, we had to replace the carpet. And we did that a couple of weeks ago. I didn't know that when you replace the carpet that you have to pack up your house, and basically it's like moving. Every single thing practically in our house that wasn't in cabinets, we have a lot of books and CDs, all this kind of stuff. All of it had to go into boxes so that they could take out the carpet and all this kind of stuff. And what I didn't realize is that while I was boxing all this stuff up, that it would be such an emotional experience for me, because one of the things I did was box up all the stuff in my daughter's room. And as you know, we've got one daughter, and she lives in Scotland now. We don't see her very often. We see her on Skype, but we don't get to spend a lot of time with her anymore because she lives so far away. So I'm sitting in her room looking through boxes of pictures. And I know I should just throw them in the box, but I'm going through them. There's a father-daughter dance, and there's all this stuff. I'm just a wreck. And then I see all these things in her bookshelf, and I open them up, and they're her calendars from like when she was in middle school and high school and college. And I'm looking at all these things that we did together because she took notes of them, and I'm just kind of wrecked. I said, Peg, we need to do something. And we did what actually is kind of a rare thing these days. I'm telling the story. Anyway, we did this kind of rare thing, and we used to do this all the time, not so much anymore. But we went to a movie. I said, Peg, what do you want to see? She said, let's go see Inside Out. It's a new Pixar movie. Pixar, by the way, these guys are the best storytellers ever. They're the people that did Up, which if you haven't seen Up, you need to rent it or watch it on Netflix or whatever. It really is awesome, especially the first 5 minutes, which is like a little mini story within a story. The story of Carl and Ellie's relationship from the time that they first met until when she dies. And it's so sad and so moving. Anyway, I decided that I need to get out of the house. I'm feeling too emotional about all this. Let's go see a movie. Peg chooses Inside Out, and I go see this movie, and it's about a mom and a dad and their only child, who is their daughter. They live in the Midwest. They move to California, and she grows up, and anyway, and it's about all the emotions that are going on in there. And at the end of it, I felt inside out myself, turned it pretty much. But this is what good storytelling will do. It'll grab our emotions. It'll make us laugh. It'll make us cry. For many, many years, C.S. Lewis wrote a number of books to kind of explain Christianity to people. One of his best-known books is Mere Christianity, and it's basically a book that was put together from radio addresses that he delivered over BBC to the British people during the Second World War as a way of kind of building morale. People would turn on every Sunday night to hear his lectures on Christianity and stuff, and they were put into a book, and they're really awesome. He wrote other books to explain Christianity to people. He wrote a book about miracles, and he wrote a book called The Problem of Pain. All these books kind of earlier in his career. But there came a point in his life when he concluded that that's probably not the best way to communicate the Christian faith to people. He thought, no, the best way to communicate the story of Jesus was by telling stories. Because when you just, share facts or data or whatever, people can argue with it. People, can push back and all this kind of stuff. But when you tell a story, they're just kind of drawn into it. And so C.S. Lewis started writing these amazing stories. And that's why we have the Chronicles of Narnia, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and so on. It's why we have his 3 science fiction books. Did you know C.S. Lewis wrote science fiction books? A space trilogy. It's why we have the Screw Tape Letters and The Great Divorce. Tremendously interesting books, fun to read, but in this, it's the story of Jesus being told in a really imaginative way. And they hold our interest, and they move us emotionally in a way that just an argument wouldn't. One additional thing stories do, in addition to holding our attention and stirring our emotions, stories help us to remember. They help us remember. Just a quick show of hands here. How many of you can tell the story pretty much of the 3 little pigs? Okay? Hands down. How many of you can tell the story pretty much of Goldilocks and the 3 bears? Okay. When is the last time you heard that story? Some of you, it's like, I hate to say it, 40 years, maybe? You can still tell that story, and it's not because you've studied that story. It's because we remember stories. Stories are sticky. And we need to remember that Jesus lived in a storytelling culture. We do too in our own way. We use media to tell stories mostly now, but Jesus lived in a storytelling culture where people shared stories by talking with them over meals and as they walked along roads and so on. And they were really even better than we are at remembering things. And by the way, one of the reasons that you can tell the story of the 3 little pigs and Goldilocks and the 3 bears is because it follows a pattern. And in good storytelling, that's one of the things that makes good stories memorable, because they follow a pattern. One of the things we'll see in Jesus' stories is some of his stories follow patterns too. They're two contrasting things or three contrasting things that build and so on. We remember stories because stories are sticky. Now, this week, we are launching a new message series called Jesus the Storyteller. I'm really, really excited about it. I think it's a great follow-up to the series that we just finished called The Story, to be looking at Jesus the Storyteller. And I'm excited about it because Jesus was a master storyteller. Now, when I say Jesus the Storyteller, some of you might be thinking this is going to be a series on Jesus' parables. And in fact, it's not. Because not all of Jesus' parables were stories. Some of them were just very simple similes. All of Jesus' stories were parables. Not all of his parables were stories. We're going to look at Jesus' stories. Jesus' stories are one of the most characteristic and distinctive parts of his teaching. And while other people told stories in the ancient Near East, Jesus' stories stand apart from all of the rest, and they are especially extraordinary. And it's my hope, one of the things I really am hoping to do in this series is for us to look at Jesus' stories with fresh eyes. Because, frankly, a lot of us, we think of Jesus' stories and we go, oh, I know that one. Oh, I know that one. Oh, I know that one. We've heard the stories so many times that they don't hold our attention. They don't stir our emotions the way maybe they did when we first heard them. We no longer see them as remarkable. I remember in my very, very first church back in Mitchell, Illinois, just outside of St. Louis, there was a kid in my youth group. His name was Darren. Excuse me, his brother was Darren. This kid was Kevin. And I saw Kevin down in the youth room. And I said, hey, what are you doing, Kevin? He says, I'm reading the Bible. And I said, really, what are you reading about? He says, I'm reading the story of Jesus. That guy was really amazing. And it's that kind of sense of amazement that we sort of miss. It's sort of like, oh, I know the point. I know the point. I know the point. If that's true for you, I really just want to encourage you to be on this journey as we take a closer second look at some of these stories that have grown so familiar we actually may miss an awful lot of what's going on in them. Now, at one time, people thought that Jesus told stories because he was trying to take sort of difficult or complicated kind of theological ideas and to put them into everyday language that everyone would understand. Sort of like, here's the idea I want to share. I can illustrate it this way. One of the things we need to understand is that Jesus' stories are not. They are not simple illustrations. Far from it. Far from it. They are so deep and so profound, and they function in such different ways. If all you're taking away from a parable of Jesus is a simple point, you are missing why the stories are being told. People also thought that Jesus wanted us to hear his stories and then come away from them with a simple takeaway message. In other words, that we're supposed to hear the stories and then walk away with the point of the stories. As we will see in this series, that does not do justice to the genius of Jesus as a storyteller. When Jesus tells a story, listen to this, folks, because it may be a surprise. When Jesus tells a story, it's not to make a simple point. It is not to do that. When Jesus tells a story, it is an event. It's an event that is intended to engage us and indeed intended to transform us. And that's way more than just getting a point. So we saw why stories work in a general way. What's different about Jesus' stories? Why did Jesus tell stories? I want to suggest three different things. First of all, Jesus told stories to open our eyes, to help us see, to help us see life, to help us see who God is, to help us to see ourselves, to help us see the world around us in a new way. It's interesting to me how all of Jesus' stories, this is fascinating, I think, and it's something that we don't consider often, but all of Jesus' stories are rooted in reality. Every single one. The narrative world of Jesus' imagination is the exact same real world in which we live. Now, if you didn't understand what I meant by that, let me offer a comparison or a contrast to it, and I'll do that in the form of Aesop's Fables. How many of you have heard of him? Okay. In Aesop's Fables, we have cows and crows, deer, dogs, foxes, monkeys, frogs, geese, grasshoppers, mice, rabbits, sheep, tortoises, animals, the sun, the wind. All of them are carrying on conversations with one another, or with human beings, or with the gods. Now, how many of you have talking animals in your life? Raise your hands. I have a talking animal in my life. And you're saying, no, you don't, Pastor Jeff. Yes, I do. His name is Jimmy. He is a cockatiel. And this morning when I walked into the family room and pulled back the cover from his cage, he looked at me and said, Jimmy's a pretty bird. We taught him to say that. But he does not carry on real conversations. He basically just mimics what we teach him to do. He can copy whistles and that sort of thing, but he doesn't really, he's a bird brain. What can I say? I love him, but not much going on there. What, Aesop's Fables, look at that. You've got foxes talking to lions, and they're, donkeys emotionally going through something in the background. When Jesus tells stories, he's not talking about talking animals. When Jesus tells stories, he's talking about workers in a vineyard. He's talking about managers trying to figure out how much to pay people. He's talking about widows who are being taken advantage of by unscrupulous people. He's talking about judges who are hearing, different cases. He's talking about farmers out there doing their work. He's talking about families, messed up families, and what's going on there. His stories are not set in some fantasy land, but they are set in homes and hostels and along roadsides and in fields and in courtrooms. And everything that Jesus talks about in his stories, they're all recognizable, real-world places where the stuff of real life unfolds. It's recognizable and real. Jesus talks about real people doing real stuff in the real world, and here's why. Because the real world is where God has chosen to reveal himself. It is in this world that God has chosen to reveal himself. This is the difference between Christianity and mythology. It's a difference between Christianity and some of the other great world religions, because they are not really ultimately about the real world. They're about a world that we can only imagine. In his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul writes, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities. So how do we know what God is really like? If God is spirit, and so how do we know what God is like? Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen. Really? How? Being understood from what has been made. We can know two things, at least, about God by just looking at the world around us, God's eternal power and God's divine nature. We learn more about who God is by looking at Jesus. But notice, in both cases, it's about real-world people and real-world events. God reveals himself to us in the real world. God sent his only Son, that whoever would believe in him would not perish but have eternal life, into the real world. God so loved the real world. Christianity is about being saved by grace through faith in the real world. And Jesus, in telling his stories, wants to open our eyes to help us see that God is right here, right now, at work in the real world. He wants to open our ears so that we will be listening and paying attention and being mindful of conversations that are revealing, and words and truths that are revealing who God is. And so Jesus says, let those who have ears hear. Jesus wants to open our eyes to help us see, again, God is right here, right now, if we will just slow down and be mindful and pay attention. Now, Jesus not only tells his stories to help us to see, but also, you ready for this one, to make us think. There is this stereotype of Christians, which I personally just have to say I resent it and couldn't take more exception with it. This stereotype that Christians don't think, that they're just told what to believe and they believe it, even though it's absolutely ridiculous. That is not true. Jesus, when he tells his stories, he tells them purposefully in such a way as to make us think. Now, not all storytellers do that. And not all stories make us think. As a matter of fact, there are some stories that are meant to communicate truth to us, that and we are spoon-fed the truth. Let's go back to Aesop's fables as a perfect example of this. How many of you remember the fable of the hare and the tortoise? A lot of us do, because Walt Disney made a cartoon out of it. The story goes roughly like this. A hare is kind of making fun of, ridiculing, laughing about this tortoise because the tortoise is so slow and all this. And so the tortoise says, you know what, you might be fast, but I believe I could beat you in a race. And the hare finds this absolutely ridiculous. It's laughable, and he says, you're on. So they set a time and a place for the race, and the fox waves the flag, and off they go. And here's the tortoise, and the hare just speeds off, and it's so boring for him, he just decides this is going to be such a piece of cake. He lies down by the side of the road, leans up against a tree, falls asleep. And as he wakes up, he looks up to see the tortoise go across the finish line. And the moral is slow but steady. And see, we even heard it in the same way. This is truth, spoon-fed for you. Inch by inch, it's a cinch. You'll get there if you just put one foot in front of the other. Jesus never tells a story and ending it with the words, and the moral of the story is, be nice to people. He never says, and the point of my story is, ... Jesus never does this. Now, if asked on at least one occasion, Jesus would explain a story to his disciples, as he does with the story that we are looking at today, the one about the soils. He tells his story, and his disciples say to him, what does that mean? And so he tells them. But his common practice, his usual practice, almost every single story ends in sort of an open-ended way. It's not all tied up and given to us in a package. It's not spoon-fed to us. Jesus tells a story, and then he leaves us with something to chew on. And if we're not chewing on it, we haven't heard it. If we're not puzzling over it a little bit, if we're not pondering it, if we're not thinking about it, if it hasn't gotten under our skin, we haven't heard the story. Finally, Jesus told stories to show us our hearts. And this is one of the most important aspects of Jesus' storytelling. It's like he holds a mirror up to us and he says, I'm going to tell you this story. Now look at your response to it. Have you ever noticed how two people can go to exactly the same movie and one of them will say, that was awesome, and the other one would say, I didn't like it? I can think of a movie right now that my wife and I felt totally different about. And it's not like we got angry with each other, but she said, I thought that was really good. And I'm like, seriously? And the opposite has occurred too. Wow, that was awesome. And she go, really? I don't get it. Why is that? You know, it's interesting, as we will see in this series, that as people heard Jesus' stories, they responded and reacted to the stories in wildly different ways. Some people listened and they left filled with hope, and their hearts are kind of uplifted, and their lives were changed and then there were other people, they heard exactly the same story, and it made them mad. And as a matter of fact, I think an argument could be made that one of the reasons that Jesus was put to death is because he ticked off too many people with his stories, too many people in power. Some people heard Jesus tell the same story, and they were moved and they were changed. Other people were confused. Some people left angry. Some people heard it and they just left. What accounts for the difference? What's interesting is one of the very first stories Jesus ever told sort of offers an answer to that question about why we hear Jesus in a different way, why we hear his stories differently. It's actually a story about his stories, in a sense. A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, that it was done by kind of broadcasting the seed, as that was a practice in the ancient Near East. So he was scattering the seed. Some fell along the path, and it was trampled on, and the birds came down and ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground, and when it came up, the plants withered because they had no moisture. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up and choked the plant. And still other seed, Jesus says, fell on good soil. And it came up, and it yielded a crop 100 times more than what was sown. Luke says, when he had said this, he called out, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. And he left. Now, as we work our way through this series, and as we study Jesus' stories together, you know what's going to be happening? Jesus is going to be sowing seeds. His stories. They're like, I'm going to throw them out there for you. Some of that seed is going to land in unreceptive soil. And it's not going to take root. And it's not because of the story, because same story will take root in other hearts. It's not because of the story, and it's not because of Jesus. There are just some people who are kind of closed when it comes to the things of God. Or it may be a period of time in your life when you're kind of closed to what Jesus has to say. And he will throw out that seed and it won't take any root. You'll go, I don't get it. That doesn't have anything to say to me. It's not about me. Some seed, Jesus said, will fall on the rock. Or it might grow up for a little bit, but ultimately it'll just wither and die. Now, people in the audience who heard Jesus originally tell this particular story, the one about the soils, A bunch of them, of course, were Galilean farmers, but even if you weren't a farmer, most folks sort of did what we would call gardening now. We do it mostly as a hobby. In the ancient world, they would have done it because it would have been a source of food. But people would have heard Jesus talk about the seed falling on rocky ground, and they would have kind of smiled knowingly as they heard that. Not only because there are a ton of rocks in the Middle East, especially in modern-day Israel, Palestine, but in many places in the Holy Land, there is this really thin layer of topsoil. And immediately underneath it, that little layer of topsoil sits right on top of these long, deep limestone ledges. Now, you could look at a field, you could look at a piece of ground, and what you would see would be soil. What you couldn't see was what's below the surface, and not very far below the surface. Rock. Can't tell by looking, but if you just scratch below the surface, even a little bit, you get it. I think my backyard is like this. It's not limestone, though. I think it's this really dense clay. Some of you guys probably have this in your yards, too. And so anyway. A seed falling on that kind of soil, the seed might germinate. It will shoot up real quick. It will try to send roots down, but they can't go anywhere. And because the roots don't grow and go deep and bring up water, the plant will wither and die. Even though it looks really great at first, it just dies. At the end of his life, a couple of weeks ago, we were looking at the Apostle Paul during our series on the story, and at the end of his life. And one of the things that he said, he kind of took comfort in the fact when he says, I have fought the fight, the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. That really comforted him. He didn't give up. He persevered. In our culture, and I think in his culture too, or he wouldn't have mentioned it, that is no small achievement. Because there is a huge difference between starting power and staying power. Most everybody can start out well. But do we have what it takes to finish? In our journey of faith, we can start out really well as followers of Jesus. We can be real excited. Say, oh yeah, I just want to follow him, and God is love, and this is so great. And we start out so well, but we never really go anywhere because there is something hidden just below the surface. Nobody could ever tell by looking at you, but there's something just below the surface of your heart that resists the work of the Holy Spirit at the deepest level of your life. The seed can grow this deep, and it'll shoot up real quick, but it'll die because it never penetrates, never takes root, and never bears fruit. Jesus goes on to say that some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew with it and choked it. I mentioned that there was one occasion in which Jesus' disciples said, we didn't understand that. Could you explain this to us? And I love how Jesus explains this part of the story. In this private moment with his disciples, Jesus tells them, see, these are the ones who hear, but as they go on their way, as they live life out, they're choked by the cares and riches and pleasures of life. They're choked by the cares and riches and pleasures of life, and their fruit doesn't mature. And I think Jesus really is putting his finger here on why so many of us get spiritually stuck. Because you would think that if you've been a follower of Jesus for 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years, that every year of your life you would be bearing more and more and more fruit. And not because, when Jesus uses this idea of bearing fruit, you don't have, it's not an effort to bear fruit. Trees just bear fruit when they're properly nourished and when they're doing what God created them to do. It's not work, it's not effort, it's fruit. And yet, sometimes we're not bearing any more fruit after 20 years of being a follower of Jesus than we did when we first became followers of Jesus. Why is that? Do we really have 20 years of experience being followers, or is it just 1 year of experience repeated over and over again? See, what Jesus is putting his finger on here is how there's too much competition in our lives. And that God gets squeezed out. It's like the fruit of the Spirit is trying to grow, but we're not giving the attention. We're not weeding stuff out of our lives. We're just adding more and more and more and more stuff to it. You know what happens when we add more and more stuff to our lives? God just either gets covered over or he gets squeezed to the periphery. And that which is supposed to be primary, a relationship with God, becomes secondary, tertiary, or who knows what. It's way out there. And secondary stuff starts taking over our lives. Jesus said, watch that. We need to weed out our calendars and weed out our what we're thinking about. Man, I get that too with packing all these boxes up that I was telling you about earlier. I'm seeing stuff that I haven't looked at for 10 years. I'm going, really? We have this? I've made so many trips to Goodwill this past couple of weeks. It's great. They love me. Now, all that being said, it'd be an enormous error to miss how the one about the soil ends. Sure, some of the seed, lands on the path and it gets trampled on and eaten by birds. And some of the seed grows up real quick, but it withers and dies because it doesn't have any roots. And it's true, some of the seed, it just gets choked out. But Jesus says, and this is kind of the climax of the parable, some fell into good soil, and when it grew, it produced 100-fold. See, this is a miraculous harvest in some hearts. Jesus, the storyteller, told his stories so that they would land in our hearts. And once they landed in their hearts, so they would send down roots and then grow to maturity and bear fruit. And this is why I say these aren't stories that are just to illustrate a point. Jesus tells these stories to change our lives. And if we hear these stories and we're not different having heard them, we haven't heard them. See, our lives cannot and they will not be changed by the stories of Jesus if our hearts are hard. And what does that mean? It means that we're closed-minded. If we have hard hearts and closed minds, and it's fascinating to me how people who imagine themselves to have the most open minds oftentimes are the most closed to certain things. We will not be changed by the stories of Jesus if our hearts are hard or our minds are closed. If we harbor hidden resistance to the work of the Holy Spirit so that the roots can't go down deep and take hold. Or if our lives are just so filled with other things that there's little time or little room for God. So let the stories of Jesus help you see God at work in the world around us and in your place of work and in your families and in nature, in the problems and challenges of life. Let his stories challenge you to think deeply about the things of God. Don't fall back on what you think you know already, because frankly, you don't know what you don't know. And Jesus tells stories so that we'll know what we don't know. He wants to expand our minds and make us think more deeply. And let these stories show you, for better or worse, the true condition of your heart. Because we're going to look at some stories, and some of you, when you hear them, you're just going to be annoyed. And you're going to be mad at me because I even am talking about them. And I'm going to tell you, hey, it's not my story. I'm just the messenger. But they'll make you mad. And when they do, you got to ask yourself a question. Why does this make me so mad? And it just might show you, I guess I'm kind of legalistic. I think I must be sort of judgmental. I don't think I really like God's grace that much. And when God reveals that to you, you know what's really cool? That's exactly where God will meet you. And that's the point at which he will change your heart if you let him.